Hong Kong, June 29, 1973, 11:47 p.m. Linda Lee was asleep when her husband came home. She heard the front door, heard his footsteps on the stairs, heard him pause outside the bedroom door longer than usual. When he finally came in, she turned on the lamp. Bruce Lee was standing in the doorway, still in his clothes, looking at her like he was memorizing her face. "Is everything okay?" she asked. He sat on the edge of the bed. He didn't take his shoes off. He just sat there for a moment, looking at his hands. "I need to tell you something," he said, "and I need you to listen without telling me I'm being paranoid." Linda sat up. In 9 years of marriage, Bruce Lee had never once described himself as paranoid. This was a man who once said the only thing he feared was a mind that was too lazy to fight. Paranoia was not in his vocabulary. What he told her that night, in a quiet bedroom in Kowloon, would become one of the most haunting conversations of her life. Because 3 weeks later, on July 20, 1973, Bruce Lee was dead at 32 years old. And Linda would spend the next 50 years wondering if what he told her that night was a premonition or a confession that he already knew exactly what was coming. This is the story nobody tells completely, not the official version, not the cleaned-up Hollywood biography, the real story. The one that starts 3 weeks before the end, in a bedroom in Hong Kong, when Bruce Lee looked at his wife and said words she was never able to forget. But before we get to that night, you need to understand what kind of man Bruce Lee had become by the summer of 1973. Because the man who sat on that bed was not the man most people think they know. By June 1973, Bruce Lee was the most famous martial artist alive. Enter the Dragon was finished. Warner Bros. Had a release date. 6 days before that release, Bruce Lee would be dead. But on that June night, he didn't know that. What he did know was that he had enemies, serious enemies, the kind that didn't send lawyers. The Hong Kong film industry in 1973 was not what most Westerners imagined. It was not glamorous, it was not free. It was controlled, at its deepest levels, by the triads, organized crime syndicates that had embedded themselves into the entertainment industry decades earlier. They controlled who got cast, they controlled distribution, they controlled financing, and they controlled what happened to people who refused to play by their rules. Bruce Lee had been refusing to play by their rules for years. It started before he even became famous. When he returned to Hong Kong in 1971, after years in America, the triad saw an opportunity. Here was a man with American connections, Hollywood contacts, a growing international profile. He could be useful. He could open doors. He could be made to cooperate. Bruce Lee had other ideas. He refused to include triad-connected producers in his projects. He refused to use triad-affiliated distributors. He refused to let them monetize his name without his consent. For a time, his extraordinary talent protected him. He was too valuable to touch, too popular to silence without consequences. But by the summer of 1973, that calculation was changing. And Bruce Lee knew it. Stop right there. Because here's what nobody talks about when they discuss Bruce Lee's death, the incident that happened 15 days before he died, the incident that his biographers mentioned briefly and then moved past as if it were a footnote. It wasn't a footnote, it was a warning. July 5, 1973, Bruce Lee attends a film screening at a theater in Hong Kong. Also at that screening is Lo Wei, a director, a man with deep triad connections, and a man who had a profound and bitter history with Bruce Lee. What happened between them at that screening escalated into a confrontation. Bruce Lee made threats. Lo Wei made threats. The situation became serious enough that police were involved. 15 days later, Bruce Lee was dead. Linda Lee knew about the confrontation with Lo Wei. What she didn't know, until the night of June 29th, was how seriously Bruce had been taking the threats that had been accumulating for months before it. He had started keeping notes. Not a diary. Bruce Lee was not a diary person, but he had started writing down names, dates, incidents, a record. The kind of record a man keeps when he's starting to believe that if something happens to him, someone needs to know why. He showed her those notes that night. He sat on the bed and he told me he had been receiving pressure. Linda would later write, not threats exactly, more like suggestions, Suggestions about how his career would go better if certain people were involved, about how things could become difficult if they weren't. She asked him what kind of difficult. He looked at her for a long moment. "The kind you don't walk away from," he said. But here's what the biographers leave out. That conversation was not the first time Linda had seen signs that something was wrong. It was simply the first time Bruce had said it out loud. 6 weeks before he died, Bruce Lee's behavior had begun to change in ways that Linda noticed but couldn't explain. He had stopped eating solid food. His diet in his final months consisted almost entirely of carrot and apple juice. His doctor would later note, with some alarm, that his solid intake was dangerously low while his water intake was extremely high, a combination that would prove medically significant. But at the time, Linda simply watched her husband lose weight and wondered why a man who had always been obsessive about his physical conditioning was suddenly unable to eat. He had started sleeping less. Not in the restless way of an anxious man, but in the focused way of a man who had too much to think about and not enough hours in which to think it. He had started carrying something in his jacket pocket. Linda never asked what it was. She saw him check it, sometimes when he thought she wasn't looking. She would later say she believed it was a list. Names, or maybe a number, a contact he had established with someone he trusted to handle certain information if he wasn't around to handle it himself. And he had started saying goodbye in a way that wasn't quite goodbye. Not to Linda, not directly, but to others. Friends who visited the house that summer would later remember Bruce being unusually generous, unusually reflective, unusually interested in talking about things that mattered to him, his philosophy, his children, his hopes for what he wanted to build. The kind of conversations you have when you're taking stock. But wait, you need to know about what happened 2 months before all of this, because May 10, 1973 is where the physical story begins, and it's the part of the story that nobody has ever fully explained. May 10, 1973, Bruce Lee is in a dubbing studio in Hong Kong, working on post-production for Enter the Dragon. He goes to the bathroom. What happens next is documented, witnessed, and still unexplained. He collapses. He vomits. He convulses. He loses consciousness on the bathroom floor. By the time his team reaches him, he is unresponsive. They rush him to Hong Kong Baptist Hospital, where doctors diagnose him with cerebral edema, dangerous swelling of the brain caused by excess fluid. His fever is extreme. His condition is critical. They treat him with mannitol. He recovers. The official explanation is that Bruce Lee suffered an idiopathic seizure, a seizure with no known cause, no epilepsy diagnosis, no identified trigger, simply a healthy 32-year-old man in extraordinary physical condition collapsing with his brain swelling inside his skull for no reason that the doctors could identify. Medical science doesn't love no reason. In 2022, kidney specialists published a paper in the Clinical Kidney Journal proposing that the collapse was caused by hyponatremia, a dangerous condition that occurs when sodium levels in the blood drop too low, often caused by drinking too much water with too little dietary solute intake. In other words, Bruce Lee's extreme water consumption combined with his near-liquid diet may have been slowly poisoning him. But here's what makes that explanation complicated. Bruce Lee didn't know about hyponatremia. His doctors didn't identify hyponatremia. After the May collapse, he was examined, declared recovered, and sent home, and he continued the same diet, the same water intake, the same patterns that the 2022 paper would later identify as the cause. Either he didn't understand the danger, or he understood it and couldn't stop. Or, and this is the theory that has never quite gone away, something else was happening to Bruce Lee's body in 1973. Something that started before the first collapse and continued until the last one. If you've never heard this part of Bruce Lee's story before, make sure you like and subscribe. We tell the stories that don't make it into the official biographies. Here's the detail that will change how you hear the rest of this story. In July 2021, 48 years after Bruce Lee's death, a collection of over 40 handwritten letters written by Bruce Lee between 1967 and 1973 was sold at auction for $462, $500. In those letters to his friend and fellow actor Robert Baker, Bruce Lee requested that Baker mail him cocaine, painkillers, psilocybin and other substances for personal use. His doctors later noted that cocaine use could have contributed to his May collapse. And suddenly the picture becomes more complicated. A man receiving pressure from organized crime, a man whose body was failing in ways his doctors couldn't explain, a man who was managing that failing body with substances that were making it fail faster, and a man who sat on the edge of his bed one June night and told his wife that he believed someone wanted him dead. Here is what June 29th looked like, according to what Linda would describe in the years that followed. Bruce came home late. He had been meeting with Raymond Chow, his producer and business partner, about the upcoming Game of Death production. The meeting had gone on longer than expected. When he arrived home, he was quiet in a way that Linda recognized as the specific quiet that meant something had happened. She waited. He came upstairs. He sat on the bed. He looked at her. And then he said the thing that she would carry for the rest of her life. "If something happens to me in the next few weeks, I need you to know that it wasn't an accident." Linda stared at him. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that there are people who would prefer that I wasn't able to finish what I'm building, and I want you to know that." She asked him if he had gone to the police. He almost laughed. The idea of Bruce Lee, who had been navigating Hong Kong's industry politics for 3 years, going to the police about triad pressure, it wasn't something he could explain to her quickly. It would have required a tutorial in how deeply the corruption ran, how thoroughly the two systems were intertwined. He didn't have the energy for that conversation. "I just need you to know," he said. They sat in silence for a long time. Before he went to sleep that night, he checked something in his jacket pocket. He put the jacket over the back of a chair. He laid down next to his wife. And according to Linda, he fell asleep faster than she had seen him sleep in months, with the specific peace of a man who had done what he needed to do and could now rest. She didn't sleep at all. But hold on, because what happened in the next 3 weeks raises questions that have never been answered. Questions about who Bruce Lee was meeting, about what was discussed, about whether the warning he gave Linda was based on something specific that he knew or something general that he feared. July 10th, 1973, 10 days after the conversation with Linda, 11 days before Bruce Lee would die. There is a confrontation at a film event. The details have been confirmed by multiple witnesses. Bruce Lee and Lo Wei, the director with triad connections, have a heated exchange that escalates beyond words. It escalates to the point where police are called, where the situation has to be physically contained. Witnesses later reported that Lo Wei made statements during this confrontation that could be interpreted as threats. Bruce Lee's response was not the response of a man who was afraid. He threatened back, publicly, in front of people he knew would carry the story. He made the confrontation visible on purpose. This is significant, because Bruce Lee was not a reckless man. He was precise, he was strategic. Everything he did was calculated. If he made that confrontation public, if he made sure that people saw him refuse to back down, saw him make his own threats, saw him stand completely unafraid in front of a man connected to people who could hurt him, it was because he wanted a record. He wanted people to know that if something happened to him, it wasn't random. Linda would not find out about this confrontation until after her husband was dead. July 20, 1973, a Saturday. Bruce Lee woke up and went to work. He spent the morning with Raymond Chow, discussing Game of Death. The meeting was productive. Bruce was in good spirits, better than he had been in weeks. He talked about the future. He talked about what he wanted to do after Enter the Dragon opened. He talked about a meeting with Steve McQueen he was looking forward to, about projects he was developing, about the vision he had for martial arts cinema as a genre that hadn't yet been fully realized. He was planning. A man who believed he was about to die does not spend his last morning making detailed plans. After the meeting, he and Chow drove to the apartment of Betty Ting Pei, a Taiwanese actress who was, by most accounts, more than a professional colleague. The exact nature of their relationship has been debated for 50 years. What is not debated is that Bruce Lee went to her apartment, complained of a headache, and was given an Equagesic, a painkiller combining aspirin and a muscle relaxant, before going to lie down. He never woke up. At 7:30 p.m., Betty tried to rouse him and couldn't. She called Raymond Chow. Chow came to the apartment. He also couldn't wake Bruce. An ambulance was called. By the time Bruce Lee arrived at Queen Elizabeth Hospital, not the closer Baptist Hospital, but Queen Elizabeth, 25 minutes away, he was already gone. His time of death was recorded as 11:30 p.m. He was 32 years old. Enter the Dragon would open in 6 days. It would gross over 90 million worldwide. Bruce Lee would never know. Now, here is where the story gets complicated in ways that the official version doesn't address, because several things happened in the hours after Bruce Lee's death that require explanation. Raymond Chow told the press that Bruce Lee had collapsed at home with his wife in his garden. This was a lie. Bruce Lee had collapsed in Betty Tingpei's apartment. His body had been transported from her apartment to the hospital. The cover story, the garden, the wife, the respectable domestic setting lasted exactly 3 days before the media discovered the truth. Why did Raymond Chow lie? The official explanation is that he was trying to protect Bruce Lee's reputation, to shield his family from the scandal of his death in another woman's apartment. This may be true, but it meant that the first public account of Bruce Lee's death was fabricated. And once you know that the first account was fabricated, the question becomes, what else in the official story was constructed rather than discovered? The Aquagest pill, the brain swelling, the death by misadventure verdict. All of it rests on a foundation that began with a lie. Linda Lee was at home when her husband died. She was not in the garden. She was not with him. She was at the house where their children were sleeping, waiting for a husband who was not going to come home. She found out the truth, not the lie Raymond Chow told the press, but the actual truth of where Bruce had been and what had happened in stages over the following days. Each stage of discovery was its own wound. But the conversation of June 29th, the warning, the jacket pocket, the specific words, those stayed with her. Because by the time she heard the official explanation for how her husband had died, she already had a different framework. A framework Bruce had given her himself. If something happens in the next few weeks, I need you to know it wasn't an accident. There are 6 major theories about what killed Bruce Lee. The official one, allergic reaction to Aquagesic, combined with cerebral edema, has been officially accepted and officially questioned in roughly equal measure for 50 years. The 2022 hyponatremia paper offered a new medical framework. The triad theories have never produced evidence. The family curse theory requires believing in curses, which most people don't. But there is one detail, one small piece of the story that every theory has to account for. And it is the detail that Linda Lee has never been able to explain away. The conversation of June 29th. If Bruce Lee died from a medical condition, from hyponatremia, from a reaction to painkillers, from a body that had been pushed too hard for too long, then his warning to Linda was the fear of a sick man. A man who could feel his body failing and was beginning to understand that it might fail completely. If Bruce Lee died from something more deliberate, from triad intervention, from a drug that was tampered with, from consequences that had been building since he returned to Hong Kong, then his warning to Linda was something else entirely. It was goodbye. And here's the thing that nobody has ever resolved. Both of those explanations are consistent with everything that happened. The sick man who fears death and the targeted man who knows it's coming. They leave the same footprints. They say the same kinds of things. They look at their wives the same way before they go to sleep. Brandon Lee, Bruce's son, died on March 31st, 1993. He was 28 years old. He was shot on the set of The Crow when a prop gun fired a live round. The death was ruled an accident. He was buried next to his father in Lakeview Cemetery in Seattle. 2 men, 2 families, 2 deaths that were both officially accidental, both under circumstances that generated questions that the official explanations never fully satisfied. The Lee family curse. That's what people called it, a supernatural explanation for a pattern of loss that felt too specific to be coincidence and too chaotic to be planned. Linda Lee has never used that language. She has said consistently that she believes in neither the supernatural nor the conspiracy theories. She has said that she believes her husband died because his body failed him. She has dedicated the decades since his death to preserving his philosophy, his legacy, his art. She has never, in any interview mentioned the conversation of June 29th in the detail that she described it to people close to her. Some things you keep. If this story is hitting different than you expected, hit that like button and subscribe. There are more stories like this one, stories that the history books leave out. The last confirmed sighting of Bruce Lee looking healthy and happy was July 18, 1973, 2 days before he died. He was photographed at a social event, laughing, surrounded by friends. He looks well. He looks alive in the specific way that only photographs of the dead capture, that retrospective aliveness that hits you in the chest when you realize you're looking at a man who has 2 days left. He looks like a man with no idea what's coming, or he looks like a man who has made peace with it. The difference between those two things is what the June 29th conversation lives inside. What Bruce Lee knew, what he feared, what he had been told, what he had figured out, none of it is recoverable now. The notes he kept, if they existed, were never found. The contact in his jacket pocket, if there was one, was never identified. What remains is Linda's memory of a conversation. A man sitting on the edge of a bed, a jacket draped over a chair, a husband who fell asleep with the specific peace of someone who has done what he needed to do. And 3 weeks later, a phone call that changed everything. July 20, 1973, 11:45 p.m. Linda Lee answers the phone. Raymond Chow is on the line. He has been trying to reach her. There has been a situation. Bruce has been taken to the hospital. She needs to come. She asks if he is okay. There is a pause. She would later say that she knew, in that pause, before Chow said anything. She knew the way you know things that you've been trying not to know for weeks. Come to the hospital, Chow said. Come now. She came. She sat in a waiting room while doctors explained things to her that she already understood. She signed forms. She answered questions. She performed, with extraordinary composure, the administrative tasks that death requires. And somewhere in the middle of all of that, she thought about June 29th. About a man who sat on the edge of a bed and told her, as clearly as he knew how to say it, that something was coming. About a man who checked something in his jacket pocket before he went to sleep. About a man who had built the most extraordinary physical instrument of his generation and then spent his last months watching it fail him, either because of choices he had made or because of things being done to him that he couldn't stop. She would never know which. None of us will. What Bruce Lee gave the world was enormous, and it came from a man who had been fighting his whole life. Fighting Hollywood, which told him he was too Chinese to be a leading man. Fighting the martial arts establishment, which told him he had no right to teach Eastern secrets to Western students. Fighting the Hong Kong film industry, which told him he would operate on their terms or not at all. He fought all of it, he won most of it, and he died at 32, 6 days before the film that would have made him the biggest star in the world was released to audiences who would finally understand what he had been trying to show them. Jeet Kune Do, the way of the intercepting fist. His philosophy was about adaptability, about being water, taking the shape of whatever container you were put in, flowing around obstacles rather than breaking against them. It was a philosophy built for survival in a world that was always trying to put you in a box. Bruce Lee never stayed in any box, and that, depending on which version of his story you believe, is either why he died or why it's so hard to accept that he simply could. Linda Lee still lives. She is in her late 70s. She has given interviews over the decades that are careful, considered, protective of her husband's legacy in the way that only someone who truly understood that legacy would be. She has never, in any public forum, said what Bruce said to her on June 29, 1973. But she has said this in a 1974 interview, asked about the months before his death. Bruce was not afraid of dying. He was afraid of not finishing what he had started. Those are very different things. 3 weeks before he collapsed, in a quiet bedroom in Kowloon, a man who was afraid of not finishing looks at his wife and tells her something he needs her to carry. She carried it. She carries it still. What would you do if the person you loved most looked at you with that specific certainty and said the words Bruce Lee said? What would you say? And would you believe them? Bruce Lee knew something in June 1973. He gave his wife a warning. 3 weeks later, he was dead. The warning is the part of this story that no theory, not the medical theory, not the conspiracy theory, not the curse, has ever fully absorbed, because it doesn't fit cleanly into any of them. A sick man warning his wife is understandable. A targeted man warning his wife is understandable. But what Bruce Lee said was specific in a way that transcends both. He said, "It won't be an accident. Make of that what you will, but don't forget it." If Bruce Lee's story moved you, if you believe some truths deserve to be told completely, like this video and subscribe to the channel. We're here every week with the stories that history forgot to finish.